The letter from Neil Garrison described a working cattle operation in the Cypress Hills of Saskatchewan. It mentioned a well-maintained property, reliable income, and a man who valued hard work and kept his word. It did not mention that the well-maintained property was a half-collapsed barn, and a house where the kitchen window had been covered with a feed sack for 2 winters. Because he had not gotten around to replacing the glass. It did not mention that the reliable income was whatever the cattle market decided to give him, which some years was enough and some years was not. It did not mention that he was 41 years old, had not sat down to a meal with another person in 4 years, and had started talking to his border collie, not because he was lonely, but because the dog was the only one around who did not argue back. The letter from Diane Bouchard described an organized, capable woman with experience managing a household and a background in practical farming. It mentioned that she was adaptable, a strong cook, and was looking for a settled life in the West. It did not mention that Diane had spent the last 12 years as an office administrator for a grain cooperative in Saskatoon, that her idea of farming was reading the market reports her employer printed every Tuesday, and that the last time she had cooked for more than one person was a potluck at her sister's house where she had brought store-bought pie and claimed she made it herself. They were both, in their own particular ways, optimists about the version of themselves they put on paper. That is the most charitable reading I can give it. The less charitable reading is that they were both lying through their teeth and hoping the other person would be too grateful to notice. They were perfect for each other. Neither of them knew it yet. Neil Garrison was the kind of man Saskatchewan produces in large quantities and exports nowhere. Lean, deliberate, with hands that had been cracked and healed and cracked again so many times they had stopped bothering to go fully smooth in between. He had inherited 400 acres from his father, turned it into a cattle operation of modest but genuine success, and had done all of it by being the sort of person who got up at 5 in the morning and did not stop moving until the light was gone. He was not unfriendly, he was simply economical. He used words the way he used everything else on that property, only when necessary, only when nothing else would do the job. He had placed the ad because his neighbor Hector had told him straight out that a man running a property that size alone was going to work himself into the ground by 50. Neil had disagreed. Then he had spent a February morning trying to manage a sick calf, a burst pipe in the tack room, and a hay delivery that arrived 3 hours late all by himself in -30, and he had gone inside that evening and written the letter. He was not looking for companionship. He was looking for a second pair of hands. Diane Bouchard arrived on a Thursday in early October. Neil picked her up from the bus depot in Swift Current in the truck, which he had vacuumed the week before, and then left a bag of mineral supplement in the back seat on Wednesday. So the vacuuming had been largely theoretical. She stepped off the bus in a wool coat the color of dried mustard, and carrying a rolling suitcase that had a small crack along the top seam held together with a strip of packing tape. She had one bag over her shoulder and an expression Neil could not quite read, which he later understood was the face of a person doing careful and deliberate arithmetic about their life choices. His first thought was that she looked competent. He could not have explained why. Something about the way she walked. His second thought was that her boots were going to be completely wrong for the mud situation currently happening in his driveway. His third thought was that he should have led with the mud situation in the letter. They drove to the property mostly in silence, which Neil found acceptable, and Diane found unsettling. She asked him questions. He answered them in the minimum number of words required. She asked about the cattle operation. He said it was running well. She asked how many head. He said 240 give or take. She asked what the property looked like. He said flat, mostly with some hills to the north. She did not ask what she was actually wondering, which was, what have I done? She saw the house. She saw the feed sack over the kitchen window. She saw the barn, which was structurally sound in the places that mattered and optimistic in the places that did not. She saw the yard, which was the kind of organized that happens when a person is practical and works very hard and has no one around to notice whether anything is pleasant to look at. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the stove, which was old but clean, and the table, which was bare except for a coffee mug and a topographic map of the south pasture. And she said very carefully, "Your letter mentioned you have a functioning household." Neil said, "It functions." Diane said, "The window." He said, "Feed sack keeps the draft out." She said, "There are other solutions to drafts that involve actual glass." He said, "None of them were urgent." She unpacked while Neil went back out to the barn. She stood in the small bedroom he had cleared for her. He slept in the other one. And she looked at the single hook on the back of the door, and the shelf above the window with a coffee tin on it full of screws and nothing else. And she made the same decision that people in impossible situations have always made. Not to leave, not yet. To see what there was to work with. What she did not tell Neil because there was no reason to tell him and every reason not to, was why she had answered the ad in the first place. Diane had built 12 years in Saskatoon, an apartment she liked, a job she was good at, a routine that held. What she had not built was anything she could point to and say, "This is mine in a way that will last." Her parents were gone. Her sister lived in Quebec with a husband and 3 children, and a life that had no particular room in it for Diane except as a holiday guest. She was 37 years old, and she was competent at everything she had tried, and she had the quiet, persistent sense that competence without direction was just motion. She had not wanted a husband. She had wanted a life that belonged to her in some fundamental way that renting an apartment and going to work and coming home to her own cooking had never quite managed to feel like. The ad had said, "Working operation, capable partner, no nonsense." She had read it 3 times. She had written the letter on a Tuesday, and mailed it on Wednesday before she could talk herself out of it. What she had pictured, based on his letter, was something like organized purpose. A man who knew what he was doing, a property that functioned, work that was real and visible and finished at the end of the day in a way that office work never was. She had pictured something with its own logic, its own demands. She had not pictured the feed sack. She had not pictured the silence that Neil Garrison carried around with him like a tool he'd had for so long he'd stopped noticing its weight. She did not cry that first night. She lay in the dark in the small bedroom and listened to the wind move across the Cypress Hills, and thought that the sky out here was enormous and indifferent, and possibly the most honest thing she had encountered in years. In the morning she was up at 5:30 because she heard Neil leave the house, and she was not going to be the kind of person who stayed in bed while the work was happening. She went to the kitchen. She made coffee. She burned the toast because the toaster ran hot and she did not know that yet. Neil came back in for his mug and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the burned toast on the counter. She said, "I know." He said, "There's a trick to it." She said, "Tell me the trick." He looked at her for a moment like he was doing his own arithmetic. Then he said, "You have to watch it. The dial's off. 4 means 7. She said, "That's not a trick. That's an entirely different toaster." He almost smiled. She saw it happen and then not happen, the corner of his mouth doing something brief and unconvinced. He poured his coffee and went back out. That was the first morning. The weeks that followed were an education in the particular kind of difficulty that comes not from hardship but from mismatch. Diane could work hard. She had always been able to work hard. What she could not do was work hard at things she had never been shown, in conditions she had never trained for, alongside a man who operated on the assumption that if something needed explaining, it probably didn't need doing. She asked him to teach her. She said it directly, the way she said everything. "I don't know how to do most of what needs doing out here. Show me and I'll learn it once," Neil said. "Once," she said, "I pick things up fast. I just need to see them." He said, "It's not complicated." She said, "To you it isn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then he handed her the fence pliers and took her to the south pasture, and showed her how to fix a wire fence without cutting herself, or leaving it loose enough that a 200-pound calf could walk through it. He showed her twice and then watched her do it. She did it correctly on the first try, if slowly. He handed her the next section without comment. That was, she understood, the Neil Garrison version of a compliment. She learned to read a sick animal by the way it held its head. She learned that the quad had a clutch that engaged about half a second after you expected it to, and that forgetting this would put you in the ditch, which she found out personally on a Thursday, and did not tell Neil about until the following week, when she could say it, without the specific tone of embarrassment she was trying to avoid. She learned that cold here was not the kind of cold that made you want to stay inside. It was the kind of cold that existed outdoors, and would continue to exist regardless of your preferences. And the only question was whether you dressed for it or suffered. She learned to cook on a propane stove with a left burner that ran hotter than the right, and she learned this the same way she'd learned about the toaster, through failure. And she kept a small notebook in the kitchen drawer where she wrote down the corrections. Toaster dial 47. Left burner turned down by half. Beans need longer at this altitude. The notebook was also where she started writing down other things. What the sky looked like before a weather change. What the cattle did differently when they were restless. Small observations that she had no immediate use for, but that felt like the beginning of knowing a place. Neil found the notebook on the counter one evening in November. He did not open it. He moved it aside to set down his mug. But the next morning, without any preceding conversation, he told her that the northwest corner of the property always got the weather first because of how the hills sat, and that if the cows were bunching up near the east fence by noon, they had about 6 hours before something moved in. She wrote it down. He watched her write it down and said nothing, but something shifted in how he stood. He was not a man who changed easily or quickly, or in ways you could track from one day to the next. He changed the way the land changed. By accumulation, by seasons, by small erosions you only noticed looking back. What Diane had arrived with was a suitcase and a borrowed competence, and a quiet refusal to be the kind of person who gave up when things were harder than expected. What Neil had never had in 4 years of working alone was someone who wrote down what he said, not because it was useful, because it mattered to her. He did not know what to do with that for a long time. The thing that broke the careful functional arrangement they had built, broke it open, past the point of mere arrangement, happened on a night in January. It had been a long day. The kind of long that doesn't come from a single difficult thing, but from the accumulation of a dozen things that were each manageable, and together were exhausting. A heifer had gotten through a fence gap. Neil had patched twice and not been able to find until she was already into the winter wheat field. The diesel in the second truck had gelled in the cold, and they'd lost 2 hours in the afternoon. The hydrant in the north yard froze solid, and they had to haul water by hand, across a yard that had developed a sheet of ice under the snow that neither of them had been expecting. By the time they got inside it was past 8 and dark and cold in the way January in Saskatchewan is cold, which is a cold that is not dramatic or poetic but simply the complete and total absence of anything warm. Diane made soup. She had gotten good at soup. You could make soup from almost anything, and you could make it fast and it was warm going down, and that was all that was required of supper on a day like that one. Neil sat at the kitchen table and did not say anything. She put the bowl down in front of him and sat across from him, and they ate in the silence they had gotten used to, which was by now a different kind of fuss than it had been in October. Less empty, more like the silence of two people who had already said the things that needed saying, and did not need to fill the space with substitutes. Halfway through the soup, without looking up, Neil said, "You stayed." She looked at him. He was looking at his bowl. She said, "I told you I would." He said, "People say a lot of things." She said, "I don't." He was quiet. Then he said, "The window." She said, "What about it?" He said, "I got the glass last week, haven't put it in yet." She looked at him for a long time. He still wasn't looking at her. She said, "Neil." He looked up. She said, "If you put that window in, I'll make you something other than soup." He said, "I can put it in Saturday." She said, "Good." That was all they said. It was not a love scene. There were no declarations. There was a man who had been alone so long that getting a window replaced was the best way he knew to say something he did not have the vocabulary for, and a woman who understood that, and met him exactly where he was. He put the window in on Saturday. It took him most of the afternoon, because the frame had warped slightly, and the fit was not perfect, and it required shimming and swearing in roughly equal measure. Diane brought him coffee twice and did not offer to help, because she had learned that Neil worked best when he was left to solve a problem on his own terms. She watched him from the kitchen, through the window that was soon to be a real window, and she thought about the 12 years in Saskatoon and the apartment that had never felt final, and the Tuesday she had mailed a letter she couldn't talk herself out of. She thought, "This is the strangest thing I have ever done." She thought, "I would do it again." When he finished, he came inside and stood back and looked at it. Glass, light coming through at the right angle, the late afternoon sun low over the hills, making the kitchen go amber and warm in a way it hadn't since the feed sack went up 2 winters ago. He said, "Better," she said, "much better." She made roast chicken with potatoes and a gravy that had taken her 4 attempts over the fall to get right, and they sat down and ate it in the new light of the new window and did not talk much, but the not talking felt different now. It felt chosen rather than habitual. The dog lay under the table between their feet, which was technically against Neil's rules, and which both of them had been pretending not to notice for at least 6 weeks. They were married in April. Small ceremony in a United Church in Maple Creek, a town of maybe 2,000 people where Neil had bought supplies for 15 years and was known for being reliable and quiet and fair, which in a town that size is the same as being well liked. Diane wore a dress she'd ordered from a catalog and altered herself because it had arrived 2 inches too long in the skirt. And she was not going to pay someone in Swift Current to do something she could do with a needle and an afternoon. Neil wore a shirt he owned that was not the shirt he worked in, which was the sartorial equivalent of considerable effort. The justice of the peace asked them their vows. Neil said his plainly and directly, the way he said everything, looking at Diane like she was something he'd decided on and was not reconsidering. Diane said hers and thought, briefly and privately, about the woman in Saskatoon who had filled out an ad and hoped for practical purpose and gotten something larger than she'd known to ask for. Over the years the property grew. They added a second grazing lease to the north. They fixed the barn, properly, a new west wall and a roof that did not require optimism to trust. Diane took over the books, which had been kept in a system Neil had invented himself that was functional, but comprehensible only to him, and she rebuilt them in a way that meant they could both see at any moment exactly where they stood. Neil built her a proper desk in the corner of the kitchen where the light was good in the morning, and he was not a precise woodworker, but he measured twice and the thing was level and solid, and has not moved in all the years since. She kept the notebook. It grew into several notebooks. She knew the property the way she had never known anything she'd rented. From the inside out, in all seasons, in all weathers. She knew which pastures went soft in the spring thaw, and which drainage problems would never fully resolve, and exactly how long the north fence line was, because she had walked it herself enough times that the number lived in her body rather than just on paper. Neil read. This was the thing that surprised her most, in retrospect. Not that he was quiet or self-sufficient, or that he worked harder than anyone she had ever stood next to. It was that once she started leaving books on the kitchen table, he started picking them up. Not literary fiction. He started with a history of the cattle industry in Western Canada. That she had ordered more out of professional interest than any expectation that he'd touch it. He read the whole thing in a week. He started reading it aloud to her in the evenings, when she was at the desk doing the books, which he claimed was more efficient than her reading it separately. And she suspected was the closest he had to saying he liked having her in the same room. He read 14 books in their first 2 years. He read more after that. He had opinions about all of them, expressed in the economical way. He had opinions about everything. And she came to know that the highest compliment he could give a book was to say nothing about it at all, but to leave it spine up, open to the page he'd been on, in the middle of the kitchen table where she'd have to move it to make room for supper. She told him once that his letter had lied. He said his had too. She said, "What did you actually want when you wrote it?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I don't think I knew. I wrote down what I thought I needed. I wasn't smart enough yet to know the difference." She said, "What's the difference?" He looked at her across the kitchen, in the light of the real window, with the notebooks on the shelf she'd built herself along the south wall because he'd built the desk. And she'd wanted to build something too. He said, "What you need keeps you alive. What you want is everything else." Neil Garrison died in 2019 at the age of 73. He had worked the property until 2 years before the end, and had only stopped because Diane had, in her direct and non-negotiable way, told him that a man with 2 replaced knees and a heart that had required professional attention did not get to spend October moving cattle on horseback, and that he could either accept this gracefully or she would hide the saddle, and she was not bluffing. Diane lives on the property still. She runs the operation with their son, who was born in Maple Creek in 1997 and has his father's hands and his mother's habit of writing things down. The window Neil installed in 1993 is still in the kitchen. The frame has been repainted twice. The glass is the original glass. She reads in the evenings mostly history. Sometimes she reads aloud to the dog, who is the 4th border collie the property has had since Neil's first one, and who listens with the same patient, unconvinced attention as all of its predecessors. She came looking for practical purpose. He came looking for a second pair of hands. What they found instead, slowly, stubbornly, through burned toast and frozen hydrants and a window that took 2 winters too long, was the particular thing that gets built when 2 people stop trying to be the version of themselves they put in a letter, and start being the version that shows up at 5:30 in the morning. Because the work is happening and they are not going to be the kind of person who stays inside. I've told a lot of stories. Most of them are about what people expected and what they got instead. This one stays with me because it refuses to be about grand gestures. No speeches, no dramatic declarations. Just a man who replaced a window and a woman who noticed that he had. Tell me, which one do you think was braver? The man who let someone in after 4 years of keeping everyone out? Or the woman who mailed a letter on a Tuesday and built an entirely different life from the one she was supposed to want?